To start off talking about Italian expansion in the 1930s, we want to remind ourselves as to why Benito Mussolini and the nation of Italy will be looking to expand. All right? First of all, we've got to bring up the fascist ideology. The IB likes to ask questions about ideological causes of war. Like, what is it about your thinking that leads you to being more militaristic? And for Italy, it is fascist ideology that glorifies war for war's sake. And what I mean by that, like, we might think a war might be a good thing if your nation is, like, threatened, if someone is putting you in danger, if there is some national interest that is at stake. You might think war is necessary. But you ultimately think war is bad. Like, no one wants to go to war. The fascists do, though. Benito Mussolini and the fascists see war as a good for just war's sake. War is good for nations. War is good for men. War is good for the state. So this glorification of war says, grow a military and then use it. Italy wants to expand. Italy wants to expand. And there's a few reasons to have imperial expansion. Italy wants to be seen as a great power of Europe. The other great powers, like Britain and France, they have large overseas empires. Benito Mussolini wants to, recreate the greatness that was once the Roman Empire. And do you guys remember the Roman Empire back from AP World? Here's Rome. Where does the Roman Empire go? All the way around the Mediterranean, right? Remember what the Romans called the Mediterranean Sea? Mare Nostrum. I heard somebody say it. Our sea. Benito Mussolini wants to recreate this. Mussolini is also a fervent nationalist. The fascist ideology is ultra-nationalistic. And as you are ultra-nationalistic, that means you are opposed to internationalism, like these nations working together diplomatically to avoid conflict. Mussolini's not down with that. He wants Italy to stand on its own and to grow on its own. Now, this kind of sounds like a contradiction because I talked last lecture about Italy, about him taking part in these internationalist meetings. Italy was at the Washington Conference in 1922. Italy signed the Locarno treaties in 25 and 26. Italy signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Why, if he's so fascistly anti-internationalist, is he signing on to all these internationalist agreements in the 1920s? What was Italy's... Why can't Benito Mussolini puff out his chest and be a little bit more of a fervent nationalist in the 1920s? Yeah. Very good. His military's not prepared, right? Military torn up by World War I. It's got to rebuild. It's got to establish itself. All right? He's not there yet. And then we add to this the economic crisis of the Great Depression. And I want you to keep in your mind that the Great Depression that begins in the United States in 1929 will impact every nation that the United States does business with, which is essentially every nation that does business, short of the Soviets. So if you are Japan, if you are Italy, if you are Germany, the Great Depression is going to be impacting you negatively economically. For Italy, they will lose outside investors, like American banks and investors that would be pumping money into the Italian government as that nation is growing. That money will now be pulled back. Crashing global prices, especially for things like grains, which Italian farmers are producing and trying to sell, will harm the Italian small farmers. Unemployment will skyrocket in Italy, which leaves a lot of Italians very frustrated and angry with their economic conditions. The fascist Mussolini-led government in Italy will respond to the economic crisis in two ways. One, pushing Italy to be what is called an autarky. Autarky. It's the word on your standards. I've now put it on the slide as requested. Autarky means to be self-sufficient, to be economically self-sufficient and independent. And here's some Italian propaganda produced in the mid-1930s to encourage Italians to buy Italian. Don't buy foreign goods, don't buy foreign products, support local homegrown industries. Just like Japan recognized that the Great Depression and the economic crisis that the Great Depression wrought said Japan can't rely on foreign nations to invest in it or to give it loans. It's got to go out and get its own. Italy is going to do the same thing. You've got to protect your own industry, and you've got to grow an empire that will support your own national industries. Mussolini then would move more aggressively to create this empire, on one hand, to support the Italian economy, on the other hand, to give Italian people something to take their minds off of their economic woes. Because when your country goes to war, you maybe stop worrying about the smaller things at home. You know, we go to war, we've been at war for 10 years, so we don't think about this anymore, but when we went to war in 1991 for the first Persian Gulf War, when we went to war in 2001 for the war in Afghanistan, even in 2003 when we went to Iraq, people generally supported the government and the government's policies in going into these places. People were more patriotic. We flew our flags. We tied ribbons around our trees until our soldiers came home. They thought about these things. So Mussolini, if he uses his military in victorious conquest, he'll get a bunch of Italian people who are, we're so poor and out of work, to feel good again. And that will bring more support for the government. So what does Benito Mussolini ultimately do? Yes? Yes. Mercantilist beliefs that you would have talked about, from the 1500s, 1600s, where European powers sought to create economic holdings overseas that they could exclusively do business with, and they were very protectionist of their own economies. Yes, very similar there. Similar ideas. Usually we don't use the word mercantilism because we associate that with the colonial periods, 15, 16, 1700s. By now, we're not thinking in those terms anymore. But yeah, when you're being protectionist of your own economy, you're kind of being mercantilist, yes. Today, we don't usually think of it like that because we're not trying to go out and get overseas colonies anymore. All right, what is Mussolini actually up to? In 1934, July of 1933, let's go to 33 first. Benito Mussolini will sign what is called the Four-Power Pact. The Four-Power Pact with Britain, France, and Germany. Not to be confused with the Four-Power Agreement. That was a part of the Washington Conference from 1922 about staying out of Asian territories of other nations like Japan, Britain, and America, and France got in on that one. The Four-Power Pact in 1933 is Italy, Britain, France, and Germany saying, hey, we are the four biggest powers in Europe, and we shouldn't really be very concerned with all these smaller nations' issues, like we are in the League of Nations, where everybody's a member. We should be the dominant forces in Europe. We should have more say than the smaller countries of Europe. This really doesn't do anything. The Four-Power Pact doesn't have much impact whatsoever, but for Italy, because they're mentioned with the three other big powers of Europe, it says, hey, we are an important nation. We are at the top. We are a great power of Europe. Do you guys remember when we talked about the great powers of Europe in the 19th century before World War I? Was Italy in there? No. Now Mussolini wants Italy to be seen as a great power. Yes?
Italy, Great Britain,
France, and Germany.
Thank you.
In 1934, some stuff is going to go down in Austria. We are going to talk about this again in a couple days when we deal with Germany. But I'm going to briefly mention it now. So if you still feel a little foggy or if you don't get all your notes, don't worry. We're going to go over this stuff again if you want to just even listen right now. In July of 1934, the Austrian Chancellor, a gentleman with the unfortunate name of Engelbert Dollfuss, is murdered by Austrian Nazis. Austrian Chancellor, essentially their president, their prime minister. Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss is murdered by Austrian Nazis. Now remember, Nazis are just National Socialists. It's a political party. There's German Nazis, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. There's Austrian Nazis. Today there's American Nazis, unfortunately. It's just a political ideology. Austrian Nazis, likely being influenced by German Nazis and Hitler, will murder the Austrian Chancellor. Because what does Adolf Hitler want with Austria? He wants to take it. He wants to unite it with Germany. Does anybody remember the German word we use for that? That used to be on the board behind me. What do we call that? Anschluss. Anschluss, with that sharpest S at the end of it. The double S. Hitler wants to have a political union between Germany and Austria. The League of Nations, or the Treaty of Versailles, says no Anschluss. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria says no Anschluss. Hitler wants it. And it looks like Hitler is using this to cause political chaos in Austria, which will give him an excuse to move right into Austria. Hey, if there's political chaos in Austria, I could go in there and calm it all down. Italy doesn't want Hitler to do this. If you guys notice, the geographic situation of Italy and Germany. Austria is right between those two nations. In geopolitical terms, we would call Austria a buffer state. All right? Now, if two kids don't like each other, like these two right here, we put John in the middle. He is a buffer. They can't get at each other, even though they don't care much for each other, because John is there to stop anything that might happen. All right? John makes it harder for the two of them to get at each other. Austria is very much a buffer between Italy and Germany. If Germany were ever aggressive towards Austria, or towards Italy, they'd have to go through Austria. So when Engelbert Dollfuss is murdered by Nazis in Austria, and it looks like Adolf Hitler might be making a move to annex Austria, Benito Mussolini says, Hitler, we're not playing this game. And he moves his armies to his northern border with Austria. He mobilizes his army. He gets ready to fight if Adolf Hitler is going to threaten Austrian sovereignty. He says, stay out of Austria, Hitler. And Hitler, in July of 1934, says, okay. Because what does Hitler not have in July of 1934? And why does he not have a military in July of 1934? Because the Treaty of Versailles said he couldn't have anything but a defensive army, a small defensive army. So Hitler's not ready for prime time yet. And this is Benito Mussolini flexing his muscles. He flexes, and Hitler backs down. Right? While this is going on, Adolf Hitler is beginning to rearm. Adolf Hitler is beginning to rearm. And this is seen as a threat by Italy and Britain and France, as Hitler starts to rearm. And guys, you've probably heard in the past that Hitler is like secretly rearming. There's only so much remilitarization that can be done in secret. Britain and France and Italy know what's going on up in Germany. All right? Secrets like rebuilding an army kind of secrets are hard to keep. So they feel threatened. So Benito Mussolini will meet with his British and his French counterparts at what is known as the Stresa Conference. And out of the Stresa Conference, the Stresa Front will be born. This union between Italy and Britain and France that looks to maintain the status quo in Europe. You guys know what it means to maintain the status quo? Keep things going on. Keep things the same. To maintain the status quo is to keep things the way they are. A Germany that is weakened because of the Treaty of Versailles, and a relative balance of power through the rest of Europe. That's the hope. To hold Germany to the Treaty of Versailles and to maintain the European status quo. Strasse Front. Now, what the Strasse Front will also do for Benito Mussolini, and notice Benito Mussolini here, wearing a suit, not wearing his military garb, right? Do you think there's a reason he chose those clothes for that day? Doesn't want to look like a forceful militarist, right? He wants to look like a diplomatic statesman. There's a reason the Strasse Front is going to allow Benito Mussolini to take other military action. Because now he feels that Britain and France and Italy are all in cahoots with each other to keep Germany in check. And if Germany is in check in the north, Benito Mussolini can now pay attention to the south. This is Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. Don't mind the spelling of the random picture I pulled off of Google Images and didn't notice Ethiopia was spelled wrong on it, or the word preferred. We don't need to nitpick. This is Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. You say Abyssinia, I say Ethiopia, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. Just be consistent when you are writing about it, if you are going to write about it. All right? Abyssinia in the 1930s was one of the only remaining independent regions of Africa. The rest of Africa was gobbled up by the European powers. Abyssinia was an independent and sovereign nation, a member of that League of Nations. Benito Mussolini wants Abyssinia. He wants to conquer Abyssinia. A number of reasons. It will be an expansion of his empire. He's all about that. It will be an expansion of his empire. He's all about that. He will gain more popular support at home if he has successful military adventures overseas. Italian people will start waving that flag and cheering for him when you can conquer territories. It would avenge a defeat of Italians in 1896 at a Battle of Adowa. The Battle of Adowa, where it was Italian forces pitted against Ethiopian forces, and the Ethiopians won, and it was an embarrassment for Italy in the late 19th century. Retaking it will avenge that defeat. He hopes also, if you take Ethiopia, you don't only get the territory, you get the people that live within it. People that could later be used in your own armies in future wars. Do you guys remember in World War I, there were Indian soldiers fighting for the British? There were black West Africans fighting for the French? Even though those conflicts had nothing to do with it, they were literally on the Western Front. You had Indians and Africans fighting on the Western Front against Germans. Italy looks to, in the future, use their colonial soldiers as weapons in their fights in the future. And then, of course, the economic reasons. Autarky means land for resources and markets for selling our goods. Despite the German rearmament that's happening to their north, the Strasse Front comforts Italy to believe that Germany's not as big of a threat anymore. So they can now focus on the south. The invasion will come following a dispute in the city of Walwal. In December 1934, in this disputed territory, Italian and Ethiopian soldiers will meet, and 30 Italians will be killed. Kind of sounds a little bit like the Mukden incident back in 1931 in Manchuria. Mussolini demands an immediate apology for this action, and he demands compensation from the Abyssinians. The Abyssinian emperor, a guy named Haile Selassie, who I highly encourage you to read his Wikipedia page. A very interesting figure, both in his life and after his life. To those of you that are interested in reggae music, the Rastafarian religion sees Haile Selassie as kind of a representation of Christ reborn on earth. It's kind of so he's like worshipped as a god figure. So Haile Selassie is the Abyssinian emperor. And he calls out to the League of Nations and says, League of Nations, help me out here. Investigate this. Come in and look at what happened here. And you will find Italy at fault. Mussolini refuses to accept any kind of League of Nations investigation. And instead, he pushes his own armies to invade Abyssinia. On October 3rd of 1935, 500,000 Italian troops will invade Abyssinia. Haile Selassie makes an impassioned plea to his members nations at the League of Nations to say, hey, I am a member with you. I'm a Christian nation. I'm a Christian leader of a Christian nation. You should be standing with me to support me and stop this aggression. And the League of Nations will again do what the League of Nations does in such situations. They condemn Italian aggression. They call for Italy to back out of Abyssinia. They do even go so far as putting economic sanctions against Italy. But remember, part of the reason Italy is even doing this is to become economically independent. So economic sanctions can't harm them in the future. But they will never put a military force together to drive Italy out of Abyssinia. By the 5th of May of 1936, Italian forces take the capital of Addis Ababa. You guys can see it right there in the middle of the country. Right there in the country, in the middle of the country. They take the capital of Addis Ababa. And by May 9th, Abyssinia is formally annexed by Italy. They formally take it over. It becomes a part of that Italian empire, which is growing. The results of this: Italy, of course, gains Abyssinia. The Italian empire in Africa grows. Relatively few Israeli losses. Relatively few Italian losses. Only 1,000 casualties through the course of this war. But Italy is creating for itself now a new enemy in Britain. Britain does not like what Italy is doing down in the Mediterranean and in Africa. Britain is way up here. It's not even on this map. But they still have the most powerful navy in the world. And they have deep interests in the Mediterranean Sea. Because the Mediterranean Sea connects Britain to a little waterway right here called the Suez Canal, which connects them to a waterway here called the Red Sea, very good, which connects them to the Arabian Sea, and it connects them to India. Britain needs this waterway to stay open. It's essential for the British Empire. And Italy starting to be aggressive in the Mediterranean and around the Red Sea is very threatening to the British Empire. So what was once the Strasse Front, Britain and France and Italy standing kind of together to keep the status quo in Europe, now Italy is breaking that apart. So Italy is now finding an enemy in Britain. And Italy is not prepared to compete against the British Navy. This war was expensive for Italy. Not in terms of men, but in terms of money and military arms spent. And this will only exacerbate economic problems in Italy. Despite the war being over in 1936, it really doesn't end the fighting in Abyssinia. Abyssinian guerrillas will for years strike at Italian interests in Abyssinia. So Italy has to keep on supporting a military in Abyssinia. The League of Nations is again rendered impotent. It can't do anything in the face of aggressive powers. We saw it with Japan and Manchuria. We now see it with Italy and Abyssinia. And as the Strasse Front seems to be breaking down, Italy will now push closer to Germany, where they once maybe saw themselves as rivals. Italy and Germany will now push closer to each other. Italy will now tell Germany, hey, if you want to have influence in Austria, that's cool. Just keep it an independent state. Maybe like be a protectorate of it, but keep it independent. And they will also agree to support German rearmament in the Rhineland. Germany, we'll talk about this more in a couple days, is going to send an army into the Rhineland region that the Treaty of Versailles said they couldn't be in. Italy's going to say, yeah, you do what you need to do. Not on my border. No worries for me. Remember that Locarno Treaty that Italy had signed with Britain and France and Germany, and obviously Italy, Belgium was in there too? That's thrown out the window with this. If we're going to allow Germany to rearm, the Locarno treaties, they're gone. So the spirit of Locarno from the 20s, where countries were like, hey, we can all stand together, that's dead. Next, the Spanish Civil War. I want to only briefly talk about what the Spanish Civil War was. You can put your pencils down for a second and just listen. The Spanish Civil War was a civil war in Spain. All right, that's enough. We can move it now. Okay. The Spanish Civil War was a civil war in Spain that pitted many Spanish factions against each other. When I'm reading about the Spanish Civil War, thinking about it now, I kind of think about the Civil War in Syria, all right? Where there is absolutely a civil war in Syria, where Syrian factions are fighting other Syrian factions and are fighting the Syrian government for ultimate control of Syria. That is what a civil war is. But there are other nations that are heavily involved in the Syrian civil war, like us. We don't support the Syrian government. We would love to see them fall. But we also don't like ISIS. So we're kind of fighting them, one of the factions in Syria. Russia supports the Syrian government, and they don't like ISIS. It's all confusing, right? But foreign powers are having influence in this civil war. We see the same thing in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. There's two main factions in the Spanish Civil War. There are the nationalists, who are kind of fascist-y people, right-wingers, and then there are the Republicans, the government of Spain, who are a lot of socialists and supported by communists in Spain. So what the Spanish Civil War does is it's like a magnifying glass on the wider issue between right-wing fascism and left-wing communism, and who's ultimately going to win this fight. Benito Mussolini, seen here, is going to put his armies on the side of the fascists. The fascist fighter in Spain, and ultimately he's going to win. His name is Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco. He's going to be supported by Benito Mussolini. We'll talk in a couple days how the Nazis in Germany are going to support Franco as well. While some Americans and some Brits and some Frenchmen are going to support the Republican side. The Soviet Union supporting the communists in Spain. So this becomes a civil war where many other nations are going to get heavily involved. But no foreign nation will get more heavily involved in the Spanish Civil War than Italy. Benito Mussolini will send 70,000 troops to Spain. And he will send an air force. You guys might have heard of or seen the famous Picasso painting called Guernica. You familiar with that? Guernica is like Picasso's painting of what war looks like through his paintbrush, right? And this is done after the city of Guernica is bombed by German and Italian planes. And the carnage of the civilians is what Picasso is depicting there. Ultimately, Francisco Franco and the fascists in Spain win. Benito Mussolini, quote unquote, wins. But like the war in Africa, this war is very costly. Not only in economic terms, but also to his armies. He's expending a lot of military resources here. And I want you to keep in mind what we have going on between Germany and Italy right now. Back in 1934, before the Spanish Civil War and before the Abyssinian crisis, I can't put this down, and my camera doesn't follow me. Back in 1934, before the Abyssinian crisis, before the Spanish Civil War, the Italian military was quite strong. The German military was virtually non-existent because they were constrained by the Treaty of Versailles. But Germany starts to rearm. Italy goes to war in Africa. Germany continues to rearm. Italy sends more forces than any other European nation to fight in Spain. And after the Spanish Civil War, we now have a powerful German military with a weakened Italian military. The relationship between Germany and Italy, where Benito Mussolini was once the elder statesman, because he had been there for 10 years before, he's going to start to take a back seat to Germany. Again, the Spanish Civil War will increase tensions between Britain and Britain and Italy. Because this is now Italy trying to exert more influence on the Mediterranean. Britain doesn't want to see that. Italy will push even closer to Germany. On the 25th of October in 1936, Germany and Italy will sign what's called the Rome-Berlin Axis. This is why we call the nations we fought in World War II the Axis powers. The Rome-Berlin Axis. An axis of symmetry is something that everything revolves around, or the axis that goes between the poles on our planet, and everything revolves around that axis. In their minds, everything, draw a line from the city of Berlin in Germany to the city of Rome in Italy, and the rest of Europe revolves around that axis. All right? What this means, this signing of the Rome-Berlin Axis, is that these two nations are going to have a relationship going forward. They are pushing closer to each other. It is not necessarily a military alliance yet. We'll get to there in a minute. In the next year, Germany, Italy, and now Japan will sign what's called the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Anti-Comintern Pact. Comintern is Communist International. The Comintern was the international organization organized and led by the Soviet Union to support communist movements around the world. Comintern, Communist International. Japan, Germany, and Italy will join together in what is called the Anti-Comintern Pact, that these three nations will oppose this expansion of communism. In December of 1937, see things happening faster and faster now. In December 1937, Italy will leave the League of Nations. The League of Nations has nothing to do with it. In the spring of 1938, Germany will send its armies into Austria to execute Anschluss, to bring this political union between Germany and Austria, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany will do it anyway. Where in 1934, Italy was ready to move its armies to its northern border to stop that from happening, now it won't stop it from happening. Anschluss happens. The Von Trapp kids are stuck. I know. You will watch that movie now with a whole different story in your mind. In the fall of 1938, following Adolf Hitler's, and I'm going to talk more about all these German actions, guys. I'm going to go in more detail in a couple days. We're going to go back over this. It'll make more sense in a couple days. Germany, remember Adolf Hitler wants to create a greater Germany, a Germany for German-speaking people? There are some Germans that live in Czechoslovakia, in a region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland. Hitler wants that part of Czechoslovakia. Benito Mussolini will be instrumental in orchestrating a meeting between Britain and France and Germany and Italy to be held in the German city of Munich. It is known as the Munich Conference. And out of the Munich Conference, we'll talk more about this in a couple days in detail. Out of the Munich Conference, with a meeting led by Benito Mussolini, will come the Munich Pact, or the Munich Agreement. Hitler gets the Sudetenland, with a promise from all of those nations that Hitler will go no further than that. Everybody's excited. We've avoided war. The Prime Minister of England, a guy named Neville Chamberlain, goes back to London and says that we will have peace in our time. We've avoided war, and the crowd goes wild. But by the spring of 1939, Adolf Hitler is moving in and taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. He violates the treaty, the Munich Pact, and takes all of Czechoslovakia. When Hitler violates the Munich Pact and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, Benito Mussolini is like, when in Rome, literally, do as the Germans. All right? It's not really the old line. But if Germany is going to be aggressive and push, Italy is going to be aggressive and push. And Italy will look across to Albania. Italy will look across to Albania. Now, Albania had long been a protectorate of Italy. Italy wanted to dominate the Adriatic. Let's go back to this map here really quick. Italy wanted to dominate the Adriatic Sea. This is the Adriatic Sea. They want to create the old Roman Empire. They got to control all this territory. Little Albania had some serious rivalry with Yugoslavia. So Albania in the 1920s was more than happy to have a friendship with Italy, basically become a protectorate of Italy. They were cool with that, but they were still independent. But by the late 1930s, Italy is going to end that Albanian independence. And they will send their armies to Albania to take over that nation. The Albanian king, a guy named King Zog, Z-O-G, the Albanian king tries to work out a deal with Italy, which goes nowhere. He tries to muster a resistance, an Albanian resistance against the Italians, which goes nowhere, and he will eventually flee that nation. The Albanian parliament will agree to join in a union with Italy, and a new fascist government is propped up in Albania. The Italian Empire grows. We're almost done here, guys. On September 1st, 1939, pardon me, before we get there. On May 22nd, 1939, Germany and Italy will sign what is called the Pact of Steel. The Pact of Steel. This is a public declaration of cooperation between these two nations. They will publicly declare that Germany and Italy are cooperating with each other. We're friends. But then there are secret agreements within the Pact of Steel that align German and Italian military and economic endeavors. They're agreeing now to support each other economically and militarily. This is now the military alliance that begins the Second World War. Now, Mussolini is making it clear, though, to Adolf Hitler that he's not ready for a general war in Europe. He's not there yet. His armies were ravaged by the Abyssinian conflict and by the war in Spain. He's not ready yet, and he won't be ready, he says, until 1943. Which is, interestingly, some of the same things that Adolf Hitler will be hearing from his own generals, that his armies aren't quite ready yet. But Adolf Hitler is ready to move. On September 1st, 1939, Germany will invade Poland, which officially begins World War II in Europe. Mussolini is not ready to fight. And so he does not join into World War II at its beginning. But as the months go on, And as Benito Mussolini hears of German success after German success after German success, and as many Italians start to question, hey Benito, you were all about war. War is here and you're not in it. What's up with you? Benito Mussolini will jump into the war by June of 1940. Almost a year after the war begins, Italy will join. He doesn't want to see Germany take everything and dominate Europe. He wants Italy to be able to gain in the Mediterranean. So he ultimately will join in that war in June of 1940. Germany was also Italy's greatest trading partner, and they needed to maintain that relationship going forward. Italy joins the war in June of 1940. In World War II, Italy will begin its aggression in Africa by sending Italian troops from their African colony of Libya to attack British forces in Egypt. Italy will also send armies from Albania to attack in Greece. Again, trying to consolidate that Mediterranean empire. In both cases, the Italian army will be pushed back, will fail in their operations in Greece and in Egypt, which is going to force the Germans to send reinforcements to support the Italians in both places. We will talk about this war in much greater detail in a couple weeks, but that is Italy involved in now World War II.